Hello Team Internet, I'm Stephen from Animo Cloud, and in less than 15 minutes, we'll deploy a PHP application to the Animo platform. Animo runs your applications without you managing servers. It's entirely serverless. That means your applications are both highly scalable and highly available. So let's just get started. So I'm going to log in. I'll be presented with my application. So I've already deployed a WordPress site, and today we'll deploy a Laravel application. So I'll name my application, and I can now add services. The first thing we're going to do is deploy Laravel. So I'm going to select the PHP version that I want and specify the public path, which in this case is /public. I can define the resources that I want to allocate to my application simply by dragging these sliders. So I will allocate 1 CPU core, 0.5 GB of RAM, a little bit of storage, and leave the replicas set to 1. I'll come back later to what this means. So with this key, I can add this to my source control, for example, GitHub or Bitbucket, and be able to deploy private repositories. As I'm deploying Laravel, I can just take the Git repo URL, paste it in here, and specify the branch that I'm interested in, which will be 8, which is the latest and greatest. So let's deploy Laravel. So Animo is now going to build this application, and the first time it does it will take a little bit of time. So we'll come back to this a little bit later, and in the meantime, we'll deploy some other services. So we're going to deploy a database from our application, which will be MariaDB. I can specify the name of the database, username and password, which I'll just leave like that for now. I can specify the resources again, so I'll specify 0.5 core, 0.5 GB of RAM, and the size of the maximum size of the database. Now I have the replicas, and its default by default is set to 3. Replicas are in effect a copy of the service. So here we have 3 replicas, and in order to have a database that's highly available, I need to have multiple copies or multiple replicas of the database. And that is so that if one of the machines has a problem, that there are then 2 other machines, i.e. 2 other replicas, that can then take the slack and continue the operation of your application. Many people, of course, are running their application on a single server from one of the big cloud providers. And of course, if that server goes down, then your entire application has simply gone offline. But because Animo under the hood operates a fleet, a cluster of servers, if one of those individual machines develops a fault, there are still other servers that can take the load. We can, if needed, custom either my.conf file, which is the configuration file for MySQL, and potentially change things like the SQL mode or maybe the query cache settings. But by default, most of these are sensible settings for the vast majority of applications. So we'll deploy this database, confirm these settings. Okay, great. So behind the scenes, Animo is now finding the resources that we've requested within the Animo platform, and it's booting. As you can see, the logs are starting to come in to say that the database is booting and setting itself up. We already have the database URL, which is an internal only URL. That means that this database is not accessible externally. is just for internal access, which is perfectly fine, of course, for my Laravel application. And it also is exposed port 3306, which is the default MySQL port. And you can just, for example, click on the URL and then copy it over to your Laravel configuration later. So we'll add another service. We'll add Redis, which is useful perhaps for storing session data in, or for a queue, or for example, for caching data. And so you can specify a password and the port. I'm just going to make a note of that password. And again, we can specify resources. So I'll do half CPU core, half gig of RAM, and deploy Redis. Redis is now booting. We again have our URL already for Redis. Port defined is 6379, which is again the default Redis port. And Redis is booted. I also have shell access here to that particular instance, so I can start shell, get into it, and for example, run the Redis CLI. If I run auth with that password, you can see that we can now, for example, and of course there aren't any keys because the Redis database is empty. So that can be very useful for debugging. If you realize later on that your Redis instance is too big or too small, you can reprovision by simply just changing these sliders. And this can be a way for you to, for example, increase the capacity if you need more, or if you realize you have too much, you can always reduce the capacity and of course then save on costs. So let's head over back to our PHP application. So we can see it's still building. So in the meantime, we'll have a look at some of the other features. So again, we have shell access, which will be useful for debugging. You can specify your environment variables here. Laravel is going to require a variable at minimum, which will be the app_key variable, which we'll add a little bit later. We have a feature called persisted folders. In order for your application to correctly function within a serverless architecture, your application needs to be stateless. And what that means is you cannot store any state locally. The state for your application must be stored somewhere else. For example, the state would be stored in a database, but because with a serverless architecture, you don't have a location locally on the server that you're running on where you can store data. And as your applications get scaled up or down, you would use many servers potentially at once. And so again, you need to have a way that this data kind of is synchronized or saved. And so the best example is accept user uploads. You probably store this in storage/upload. So what I can simply do is specify the path that I want to be persisted. So this would be /storage/uploads. And Animo will then make this particular folder persisted. So any files that are written into there will be saved permanently. We have our Git deployment configuration here, where I can specify the repository and branch, and also get the auto deployment webhook. So every time a change is pushed to a particular branch, that it can be automatically deployed. Again, I can change the CPU and memory configuration if needed. And it looks like our Laravel application is now running. So I can click this icon here. And it looks like it's deployed. Laravel is complaining that we don't have an app key, so we'll go back and add an app key in a second. But before we do that, I just want to note that we already have a temporary URL here, and even an SSL certificate already deployed as well. So we already have HTTPS. So what we'll do is we will add an app key and deploy that. Okay, good. So if I now refresh, we can see that it now works. But what you'll note is that it's load balancing here between the old instance where there is no app key and the new instance where there is an app key. And that's just because Animo is doing rolling updates. And that means that it's only going to kill the old instance once it's happy that the new instance is running correctly. So if I keep refreshing, we'll see that it's load balancing, and now it's killed the old instance. You can see that it's just hitting our working version. So that's a demo of Animo. I hope this was interesting, and you can find out more information at animocloud.com.